Good afternoon or good evening, everybody, wherever you are. I'm Winston Fritsch from CEBRI, the Brazilian Center for International Relations, and I welcome you to another seminar organized by our Environmental and Climate Change Group. Today, you have the pleasure of having Mark Carney as the key speaker on the theme climate change, governments, and financial sector, the road ahead. Mark, it's a pleasure having you at CEBRI today. Now, even serious journalists covering COP26 have reported, not without surprise, that money men took the whole thing over. This sounds an exaggeration, but I think it's in some sense true. And I think Mark had a lot to do with it. I will remind you that Mark was there at COP26 as both UN Special Envoy for Climate and Finance, as well as the chairman of the GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, an institution supported by 450 of the largest financial groups and corporations in the world. He built in a couple of years to support climate action. The question of whether this is bad or good, is it bad or good that the bankers took over? I will leave to Mark to answer as a provocation. But I'll try to give an idea of how this happened. How has finance become such a large topic at COP26, where it has never been anything like that? In my view, there are two reasons for that. The first was the growing awareness of the problem of climate change, the growing scientific consensus from the ever more precise climate models relating climate change to carbon dioxide emissions. I mean, this relation was known for a long time, but the evidence that was permitted by the growth of the quality of the models, and that has to do with the speed of computers, the size of computers, big data. This evidence made a mockery of the non-binding commitments that were made under the Paris Agreement, which was actually the best of all COPs until then, especially because China actually grew in one generation to become the second largest economy in the planet, using a legacy coal-based energy matrix. Now, this evidence showed beyond any reasonable doubt that we were accelerating towards a climate disaster during the century. But this is just part of the story why the world financial system came out of its comfortable agnosticism about climate change. The other part of the story has a lot to do with work Mark Carney has relentlessly been doing since he made his famous speech at the Lloyd's of London, the big reinsurance, the venerable institution of reinsurance, saying that climate change was a significant systemic risk to the financial system. At that time, wearing a black tie, he spoke with the authority of both a well-trained economist, Mark has a Harvard BA and an Oxford PhD, of an experienced banker, with, 15 years at Goldman Sachs, maybe. And last but not least, a financial policy authority, having been at the head of the Canadian Central Bank during the Lehman crisis, which actually welcoming him at the central bank. And also, and that was, I think, his crowning achievement as a policymaker, being at the time of the speech, the first non-British citizen to run the venerable institution of Threadneedle Street, the Bank of England. I mean, no small thing. So at the time of the Lloyd's speech, he spoke not only as the UK regulator of the insurance industry or the financial system, but also as a chairman of the Financial Stability Board. And for those of you who do know the organization of the G20, the Financial Stability Board is the highest locus of financial authority in the globe. I mean, it's an informal financial decision-making body of the G20. So when, from this point of authority, he pointed that climate change was a systemic risk, he was heard. And the nice thing is that he did not sit down after the speech, he started to act. I think he acted both as the chairman of the SFB and as a regulator for a while. he created the Task Force of Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. I think that's an MTCFD, which led to the enforcement of compliance rules to avoid greenwashing, which threatened to demoralize climate action. And since he left the Bank of England at the end of the decade, I think 2020, he started his relentless campaign as a private individual with the private financial sector that led to the task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets, the GFANZ, the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and the high-profile participation COP26. So in my view, this action is to a large extent responsible for the pressure from the private sector behind the approval of Article 6. I don't think that Article 6 would have been approved, as it had not been for ages, without that, let's say, moral suasion. And that single fact, which I think may be the most important thing that happened in COP26, this will allow a growing international trade in carbon credits, helping investment and easing the adjustment towards a net zero economy, creating a new world. So that's why the road ahead in our talk is so important. Now, whether this is bad or good, and what is the road ahead, I will leave those questions to be answered by Mark. But before passing the floor to you, Mark, I would like to introduce our commentators. And many of you who know Isabella Teixeira may have noticed she's not with us today. Unfortunately, an unforeseen event prevented him to come here, and she very much regrets, and she sends her apologies for that. But we have the other grand dame of the CEBRI, Ana Toni, the CEO of our Instituto Clima e Sociedade, who's also a sponsor of this event, and is with us today. Fernanda Necchio, Princeton PhD, former director of Central Bank, now at the San Francisco Fed. And Joaquim Levy, the former Minister of Finance, and now at the Banco Safra. So with that introduction, without much ado, I'll pass the floor to Mark. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Winston. It's a great pleasure to be joining joining you all virtually. I wish I were there physically, but this is the next best thing. It's wonderful to be on a panel with my good friend Joaquim Levy, who was an outstanding Minister of Finance and a giant in international policymaking, both in that role and at the World Bank. Part of the reason why the FSB is effective is because of people like Joaquim who bring ideas and action to them. I liked your provocation at the start. I'll respond directly to it. Are the money people in charge? Are the money men and women in charge? No. They're enablers, and they create opportunity to address the issue, and on a scale of opportunity that comes out of this. And what I'd like to do in the time allotted me, and I'll try and keep it only to the time allotted me, so I'll set my stopwatch here. See how I already took a minute, but now I'm setting my stopwatch. I'd like to talk about the outcomes from COP to set up the road ahead, how we address the credibility challenge of why this time could be different. And Winston, I think you were right to say that coming out of Paris, it was, I think the term you used was a mockery in terms of the implementation relative to the ambition that came out of that. So I want to address why this could be different, famous last words, of course, and flag some of the key issues going forward for the system with an emphasis on finance, but not exclusively on finance, and hopefully help set up some of our discussions. I'd start by saying that, a few years ago, the financial system really held a mirror to the climate crisis. There were breakthroughs at Paris, as you noted, in terms of the approach to addressing climate change. But the reality was that few countries had net zero commitments themselves. Fewer still had adequate policies to get on track towards net zero. Business investment in decarbonization was relatively limited, and business net zero transition plans were by exception. And most in the financial sector considered climate change to be a corporate social responsibility issue, not a strategic imperative. And of course, it was that element, the thinking that climate change was someone else's problem, which helped create the concerns, the financial stability concerns about a future climate Minsky moment, the tragedy of the horizon in finance, and of course, more broadly in society, which left us in a position not addressing the issue. You know, the consequence, and to keep with my mirror image, if you will, when a few leading financial institutions, such as the insurance companies AXA and Allianz, or Japan's pension fund, and even in recent years, the Bank of England, when they looked at the implied temperature rise of the companies in their portfolios which really were representative of the capital markets and therefore the economies as a whole, they revealed that the world was on course for more than 3.25 degrees warming. So inconsistent, obviously, with Paris and what's required. And that's one of the reasons why our goal for COP26 was to help put in place a financial system in which every decision took climate change into account, where it wasn't someone else's problem, where it was taken into account, all as part of a broader COP26 objective to, quote, keep 1.5 degrees, 1.5 alive. So what did Glasgow accomplish? And I'll say up front, I'm going to give you a glass half full version of what came out of Glasgow, in part because I believe it, but also to frame what is possible coming out of Glasgow. And the first thing to say is that for the first time, the world really coalesced around net zero transitions for 1.5 degrees. You recall from Paris, the objective was less than 2 degrees with a stretch objective of 1.5. Progress since then has obviously been limited. We're at 1.1 degrees already. And it's actually been the case where we've had more frequent extreme weather events. We've had the last 5 years have been the hottest on record. 2020 was the second highest level of insured losses on record. The highest was the year prior, and had the largest protection gap on record. In other words, uninsured losses around the world. And the science is telling us that the lessons from what's happening with the degree warming we've already experienced, the lessons in terms of the impact on extreme weather, is that the nonlinear impacts of moving from 1.5 to 2 degrees is even greater than previously thought. So the consequence of that, in part because of that science, the agreement both at the G20 leaders in Rome just prior to COP and at COP with the 195 plus countries, was to target explicitly 1.5 degrees with no overshoot. So not actually limiting the increases to 1.5 degrees, not arriving at 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. So even though it's harder to achieve a significant tightening of the objective. The other thing that's happened over the course of the last 18 months is that the proportion of emissions globally that are covered by net zero country objectives has risen from 30% to 90%. And the add up of all those country objectives is now 1.8 degrees, at least within sight of 1.5 degrees. Now, the second point, of course, we must, as the English say, mind the gap. Stated policies are around 2.4 degrees, so there's a significant gap between objectives and policies. And as we learned from Paris, implementation may not even match those policies that are on the table. More encouragingly, there were a series of side deals at COP that do matter. 100 plus countries, including Brazil, pledged to end illegal deforestation by the end of this decade. Over 100 countries, including Brazil, pledged to reduce methane by 30% by the end of this decade. There was a less large but still significant coalition of countries committing to end coal generation in advanced economies by 2030 and by 2040 in emerging developing economies. Now, there's controversy and focus on the latter for the broader agreement, but still a significant critical mass there, and a series of agreements around transportation, which are material if implemented. And as you indicated, Winston, another significant event was completing the Paris rulebook, and that means completing Article 6 and creating this huge opportunity for a scale global market in carbon offsets. And part of what is making the scale of that market possible is the surging private demand to compensate for emission. And that goes to a larger point, which is the private sector is more engaged than ever before. It's moving at pace and with purpose. And the private sector is not concentrated on vague commitments to sustainability, well-meaning commitments to sustainability, but their commitments are much more anchored in clear outcomes. That includes more than 5,000 companies with science-based targets and net zero plans consistent with 1.5 degrees. And as you referenced, a financial sector that is being reoriented for the net zero transition. And let me spend a moment on that. A year ago or 18 months ago, we set out 24 major deliverables for COP26 to help transform the information, the tools, and the markets at the heart of finance. All were delivered for COP26. I won't go through them all, but I'll highlight a few. The first is mandatory disclosure based on the TCFD. TCFD launched as a concept 6 years ago at Paris. Critical in this regard was the launch of the IFRS's new International Sustainability Standards Board with a second pillar of mandatory disclosure around sustainability. It will begin with the TCFD. It amalgamates voluntary standard setters, basically all the voluntary standard setters from SASB, Integrated Reporting, TCFD, those standards, and in many cases, the individuals who've been working on those standards coming into this new ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board. They've released a technical, what they call a disclosure prototype was released at COP, but the draft disclosure standard will come out by the middle of next year, which those of us in financial regulation know is lightning speed in this world. Importantly, the ISSB was endorsed by more than 40 countries, representing almost 80% of global emissions, including Brazil, all the major emerging developing economies, the European Union, and the other G7 members. The second big pillar I'd like to flag is widespread climate stress testing of banks and insurers, those in the audience in the case of Lloyd's of London. And this is a process that brings the future to the present, and it reveals on one pathway the tragedy of mounting physical risks if we remain on our current path of not doing enough. And on another path, the scale of stranded assets if the world succeeds in its mission to control climate. We have over 100 members now in the NGFS, this group, including, Fernanda was there at the launch, including the Banco do Brasil, the central bank in Brazil. Those 100 members account for over 90% of global emissions. And this widespread climate stress testing and new supervisory approach really bringing climate risk management into the heart of finance. That will be buttressed by IMF surveillance via their Article 4s and FSAPs to spread these best practices. Now, I could go on, I won't, but there's a series of what to those on the outside will seem like arcane changes to the plumbing of finance are really essential to moving climate change from the fringes to the forefront and transforming the system in the process. And it's in this context where the world's largest banks, asset managers, insurance, pension funds increasingly see climate as both a fundamental risk to be managed, but also, and this is critical, a core driver of value to be seized. And the transition to net zero is becoming a strategic imperative for companies and financial institutions. And that's necessary because only mainstream private finance, and this is why it's necessary to have the money people at the core of this conversation, only mainstream private finance can fund the estimated $100 trillion of investment needed over the course of the next 3 decades for a clean energy future. To put that in context, that's an additional 2 percentage points of global GDP and investment every year, year in, year out for the next 30 years in every corner of the world. Now, 2 years ago, when the UK and Italy assumed the COP presidency, only $5 trillion in private financial assets were committed to net zero. Today, as part of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, over 450 major financial institutions, including leading ones in Brazil, from 45 countries, are committing to manage their balance sheets that total over $130 trillion in line with net zero. And this is the waterfront of finance: banks, insurers, pension funds, asset managers, export credit agencies, stock exchange, index providers, etc. So the money is now there. This was my enabling point at the start. The money is now there if the world truly wants to address the issue. The total cost of that transition is around $4 trillion every year for the next 3 decades. So there's enough available resources as these portfolios turn over to decarbonize. So that's my précis of what happened in Glasgow. More happened than what I just said. But I want to address as my second topic the credibility challenge. There were some watershed achievements in Glasgow, but many are understandably skeptical of them. After all, if governments didn't follow through after Paris, why would finance follow through after Glasgow? And there are several ways we can help ensure that for private finance, the road from Glasgow isn't paved with just good intentions, but actually paved with credible actions. And the first is that GFANZ and members are focused on near-term results. They haven't just committed to net zero financed emissions by 2050 at the latest. They've also agreed to target their fair share of the 50% greenhouse gas reductions by the end of this decade that's needed to keep the world on track for 1.5 degrees. And within 18 months of joining, banks must also set out detailed sector-specific emission reduction paths. Now, the fact is you can't greenwash emissions. They are hard numbers that either go up, stay the same, or go down. And that's why we're getting every member of GFANZ to report their progress annually, allowing all stakeholders to judge who's moving fast enough and to challenge those who aren't. The second thing is that GFANZ members are required to use the most rigorous science-based transition scenarios, such as the most robust 1.5 degree pathways from the IPCC and the IEA. And they're held to account by independent technical advisory council, where we have the best on. The third is that the group is already working with stakeholders to translate science-based pathways into real-world transition plans, both for the companies that the financial institutions finance, but also the members of GFANZ. This guidance is being given by an expert advisory panel of independent NGOs and academics, the UNFCCC's Race to Zero campaign, and a new group of experts on net zero standards that the UN Secretary General is convening coming out of COP. GFANZ also will have an ongoing reporting relationship to the G20's Financial Stability Board, and colleagues will recall that that was the arrangement that we put in place for the TCFD when it was a voluntary private initiative. Now, my third topic, and I'll try and be quick here so we can get to the debate, is around, I wanted to put on the table a few issues on the forward agenda. First and foremost are the need for credible and predictable government policies. The financial sector can't drive down emissions by itself, it's an enabler. And what we found is that ambitious, credible, predictable policies that are on the path with government's own net zero pledges and commitments can accelerate and amplify, can be accelerated and be amplified by the private sector. And so those include, in some countries, pledges to remove or to end internal combustion engine vehicles by a certain date, 2030, for example, in the UK. They include legislated carbon price paths, such as in Canada, out to 2030, hydrogen fuel blends, other measures of deep decarbonization at a date certain in the future that drives investment today. The second big issue is there are elements of the financial architecture which we still need to complete for net zero. We need to define best practice science-based net zero transition plans for both companies and financial institutions. That's going to be central to how the system works. And as that best practice is developed, these plans should become mandatory. And it was instructive that the UK government, the Chancellor, announced at COP that the UK will make net zero transition plans mandatory for large listed firms in the UK. The second thing we need to do as part of the framework is to develop a comprehensive approach to wind down stranded assets transparently, responsibly, and consistently with the net zero transition. We need also to work on core financial market indices and benchmarks to align them with the transition in order to bring the power of passive capital to support that transition. And finally, we need to integrate carbon offsets to the net zero transition, establish the appropriate use. Clearly, the primary responsibility of companies and those who fund them is to reduce absolute emissions, but offset markets can compensate for residual emissions along these pathways, creating co-benefits for nature, breakthrough technologies, indigenous communities, and emerging and developing economies. And on that last point, I'll flag my third major issue on the way forward is we do need new frameworks in order to scale finance to emerging and developing economies. Carbon offset market can be one. It can scale up quickly, we think, to the $150 billion a year, and particularly for markets such as Brazil with material impacts. But ultimately, the requirements for mitigation and mitigation alone in the emerging and developing world is an additional, on most estimates, an additional $1 trillion a year in annual financing. So the possibility is there. There's enormous resources now being dedicated to net zero. But we need, we're arguing, a new country platform approach that deploys blended finance at scale and with high multipliers, that connects private finance with ambitious country NDCs, and helps manage the wind down of stranded assets such as coal generation. And we're developing specific proposals, and I think this will be the critical year in order to see whether those really gain traction. Now, the last things I will flag is that on a forward agenda, a greater emphasis on nature and resilience. Net zero obviously is a necessary but not sufficient condition to rebuild biodiversity in nature. We must also be nature positive. I recognize that this is a much more complex and difficult issue to deal with, as if dealing with climate change is easy, but I have to recognize that. And let me just conclude, because I am coming up against my time. I think we have moved from a position where finance was a mirror that was reflecting a world that's not doing enough. It's become, to extend the metaphor, it's becoming a window through which ambitious climate action can deliver the sustainable future people all over the world are demanding, and in doing so help end the tragedy of the horizon. There are new opportunities for companies and countries to raise their ambition, whether it's tackling deforestation, ending the use of coal, phasing out fossil fuels, and financing a renewable and zero emission future. The finance is there. The challenge now is to channel it to where it's needed the most. And with that, I will stop and hand back to you, Winston.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you also for being right on the spot in terms of time and for highlighting two things. First, not only the commitment of the private sector, but also both the importance of regulation and the nitty-gritty and how complex it is, the plumbing, as you say, of the whole thing, but and regulation and governments. But this is a necessary condition, but not sufficient, because this is a global externality. You need some coordinating role. So you also reminded us of the continuous role of the UN on coordinating these actions. So thank you for pointing all the aspects of the road ahead. It's a very complex fight. It's a long-term fight, but I think it's a good start. Now, I'll send the ball now to Fernanda for the first commentary. Fernanda,
thank you. Good evening, everyone. And I'll start by thanking Winston and CEBRI for organizing this event. And also thank Mark for his remarks. I think he raised so many interesting points today, and I'll use this opportunity to go back to a few of them and hopefully leverage a little bit on his experience, both as a private citizen working on climate-related issues, but also as a central banker. I have been working on climate economics for some years now. My focus has been on central banks mainly. You know, in my previous position at the Central Bank of Brazil, I helped put together the sustainability agenda of the bank with a focus on concrete actions on supervision, regulation, internal measures, and policy-oriented actions. But throughout this process, I couldn't get past the fact that central banks were missing a more comprehensive and systematic way of approaching and acting on climate change issues. and the impact on the economy. So I felt that in the same way that central banks use academic research and approach issues related to monetary policy and other questions using academic research as a background, we should do the same with climate questions. So with that in mind, I recently joined the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco to lead a team of academic researchers with a focus on climate change and the impact on the economy. So basically the role of the team is to conduct and produce academic research, and that it's going to serve as a guide to central bank on their actions related to climate change. Academic research on climate should provide stepping stones for central banks to understand the challenges brought by climate change and the impact on the economy and economic agents. And so far, the literature on this from an economic perspective is relatively new relative to other subfields of economics, but it's growing really quickly. And among other things, we already see how households and firms are responding to climate change and to the expectations of things changing ahead, how shocks have become more frequent, how climate change impacts prices and supply chains. And we have been experiencing recently how supply chain disruptions can be a big issue. And we also see how the financial sector has been responding through their investment decisions. So all these examples in the academic literature show us that climate change is having important effects on the economy. And therefore, it is within the mandate of central banks to fully understand the transmission channels. Now, the word mandate is key here, both in my previous position and on my current position. The actions of central banks are guided and limited by the mandates. And I think this is bringing me to my first question to Mark. In currently my position and in my previous one, questions on the mandate of central banks and their actions on climate come up very frequently. In your remarks, you mentioned the importance of developing a carbon offset market, and this is well known and have been talked about for some time. In fact, previously in my position at the Central Bank of Brazil, we were approached a few times to talk and have conversations about developing such market. And my question is, if we keep central banks' mandates in mind, is there a role for central banks in helping develop that market and or participating on this? And if there is, how should be their actions regarding carbon offset markets, and still thinking about the mandate topic? And still related to carbon markets, what are the necessary ingredients for a country to be inserted and develop such markets? Should we think that each country should have its own? And how do you think about these markets and the trade gains that you can have from that in trying to integrate both developed economies and emerging economies in such a market? So I'll stop here, leave these two questions for now. Thanks again for the opportunity, and I look forward to the discussion and the answers.
Thank you, Fernanda. Mark, what I propose that we get all the comments and then you respond to the package, and then we go to the questions of the public. Thank you, Fernanda, for the questions from experience. Now, Joaquin, the floor is yours.
Hi, first, it's great to be together, and I have to thank Mark for the kind words he said. And I think it's an incredible opportunity to discuss such an important topic, and so important to Brazil. Brazil can be extremely affected by climate change. We know the tropical areas are the ones that will have the brunt of the change, and including the Amazon. I mean, independently of what we do with the Amazon, if you have 2 or 3 degrees, it would be a completely different environment. Now, in terms of comments, I would say that what Mark reported and Winston mentioned is really remarkable. A tremendous progress in all what Winston called the plumbing. As Mark was, telling us so many things, I could only be impressed by how many things that 3 or 4 years ago looked like dreams. I talked about IFRS. Things that we somewhat worked together and we're pushing. It's amazing the achievement that was achieved. Everything about the NGFS, and then this relates to the work of Fernanda and even IMF, including climate issues in their surveillance. These things have a tremendous impact. We often don't realize that. Those who are outside these things don't fully realize that. And these also are very important for something that Mark mentioned, which is this helps the private sector to do what they want to do. It helps the financial sector to finance things, because ultimately these are the underpinnings of how you can develop the new policies and provide the guidances for the financial sector, what to invest and not to invest. I think he also mentioned the issue of index. I think there's a long way to in this area. There is a lot of wonderful efforts at this point, but it's not easy. It's very tricky, but it's very important. As he mentioned, passive finance today is perhaps the largest part of the assets under management. So to have index that really are aligned with the transition is very important. I'd say two things. One is global, and then there's a direct link to Brazil. Ultimately, the big challenge is how you make the energy transition. We already have a number of technologies that in some places have a large potential and are cheaper than fossil fuels. But this is not universal, and it's not clear what can be done, and especially how you leverage the finance. It's very interesting what he mentioned about the stranded assets. In many cases, the new technology is cheaper than the old. The question is how you share, say, the gains with those who have the stranded assets, or sometimes workers in a plant, in a coal plant, whatever. When you move to the new technology that is even more productive and so on, but if you don't share some of these gains, you're not going to achieve the transition. So there, one, finance has a role, because finance is exactly how you move resources across time. So you bring a little bit of the gains in the future to people today, but also you need regulations that split this gain in fair ways and address the worry of many people that they have for any change. And then just to complete, it's in Brazil, fortunately, we don't have so much of this problem. Actually, for us, we don't have a legacy industry that is very complicated to move out. We already have a very clean energy matrix, which means that you just have to accelerate what we are doing. We need some regulations and need some guidelines, this vision that Mark mentioned, but we are in a very good position for this new world of electrification and using the solar and wind and so on. So a bit the question, I don't know if I didn't understand from Winston if you should ask any question now or just comment and leave the question for later. But maybe I just mentioned the question. I move from that to something that's very specific for Brazil, taking for granted that we don't have much of a problem in the energy side, in the electrification side, even in the industry side. We all know that the big problem is in the nature-based side. And there we could talk about, you mentioned methane, so how you address methane from livestock. And basically, what can you expect really from offsets, from voluntary or regulated carbon markets? The hurdles seem enormous for Brazil. most of our ability to capture carbon is temporary, it's not permanent. I mean, a tree has a lifetime and has some risk. How can we get the right, say, methodologies, the right framework, so that the benefit of this sort of capture is fully recognized and can lead to these global carbon markets? And this is important for Brazil, but I think it's important for the whole developing world. And I would comment in particular with respect to trees and the nature solutions like carbon on the soil and the things, is that these are short-term solutions. And the methodology that we have today, in a way, works against that. We want permanent capture, sequestration. But we all know that we are in a race. So whatever carbon that is sequestered today or is not, it's avoided today, has a tremendous value, because ultimately you will decelerate the warming of the atmosphere, and you give time for the other maybe more permanent solutions. But you cannot wait. Every year, as you mentioned, Mark, you have the extreme events, you have, the corals. The deterioration is happening. And you know this is a process that even when you get to net zero, the heating will continue because there's inertia in the whole thing. So I'm getting to this point just to say that you have a certain urgency of recognizing the solutions that you have today. And I know that you were extremely involved. You didn't mention, but you're extremely involved with all the effort for the task force for the voluntary carbon market, the work IIF, and so on. It's something that Brazil has not been very much involved. I remember, and I always highlight that you made a point of inviting Brazil to participate in the Bloomberg, the TCFD, and that was very important. Now in this task force for the carbon markets, I think Brazil has been less present for a number of reasons, nobody's fault, but there is an important work in terms of governance, of ensuring the integrity, but also I think it's the way to give the urgency of using these solutions to address the global climate challenges. So my question, sorry for the long explanation, but it's really, what can we say about the offsets, and especially nature-based offsets, and how do you see these in the general architecture? Thank you so much.
Welcome. That's an important question, Joaquin. Now we pass the ball to Ana. Ana has, as you know, Mark, has been a leading figure in the Brazilian private sector action at COP26, has been there. He just came back. So you probably have something to say about what you've done there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Wilson, and obviously thanks CEBRI for the invitation as well and the partnership. And Mark, really, really good to hear now from you, because I was at the COP for the whole 3 weeks, and definitely you made a splash at the COP. And no doubt on the 3rd was just the news about the Global Finance Alliance for Net Zero was everywhere, the 130 trillions, everybody repeating that. And so it made a really big impact. And as you said, everybody can come out of the COP and see the glass half full or half empty, depending on their own perspective and the expectations as well. Was definitely a COP that was, science was like screaming of what needs to be done, and the streets and the people on the streets were also streaming, and we had their governments. But I think the private sector, and especially the financial sector, when I was at the COP in Madrid, we didn't see the financial sector there. Really, we didn't see. Perhaps where we went. This time at the COP in Glasgow, the financial sectors were everywhere. Now, you had engagement in all the different places. Obviously, the big announcement of 130 trillion was like huge. So you had really made a huge impact. And money is power. So obviously, many of us have been working for years of getting the financial sector more involved. Obviously, you've been leading that work, but we that have been outside the civil society wanted the financial sector to be involved, because when the financial sector gets involved, you guys go quick. And we could see from Madrid to Glasgow how quick you went, which is great. And I think Glasgow for me was a place that it is clear for all the players. If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And the financial sector realized that if they were not to come up with solutions and pledges and very concrete things, they were part of the problem because they were not trying to be part of the solution. So that, in my view, was very much welcomed and necessary. However, I've been spoiling a little bit because despite of that, you got a lot of criticisms from different sources, and we did hear a lot of criticism at the COP. There's always criticism about anything anybody does. So I don't think you have the privilege of being criticized, all of us have. But I just want to remind some of the criticism. One is that many people is against offset. And they saw the initiative as the finance initiative for net zero is not only buying time, as Joaquin explained, and needing to invest on where it's easier to decarbonize quickly, but also giving not putting enough pressure on the areas that we need to decarbonize, giving time for the wrong players. Somebody said that. The other criticism I heard was very much that people wanted that the Global Financial Alliance, when they made the pledge, would be much stronger on fossil fuel. On areas, obviously you talked about financing green projects and financing the transition, for example, of transport and agriculture, but people wanted to hear what you're going to not funding coal or fossil fuel. There was a lot of expectation there that the financial sector could go in front of regulation, not behind. It is voluntary, we know, and I think it's quite interesting to see this voluntary together with the multilateral agreement. But I think one of the biggest issues, we were in a COP where the financial sector comes with a number 130 trillion. We all love it. And governments are not even able to get the 100 billion. And people are saying, are we talking now? What are we talking about? 130 and not 100 billion put on the table. And let us get concrete, put the 100 billion first on the table so we can talk. So there was some of those criticism, and I'm not asking you at all to respond to any of them, because as I said, criticism are always there. But I would like to ask you what you are concerned. Where do you see the difficulties of implementing the pledges that were made? Where, I mean, now we are in the moment of implementing, and as you said, you have a very good, strong roadmap for implementation, but I would love to hear your concerns. What are your real concerns that we all should pay attention on the implementation? And secondly, if you can say anything, we talked, Joaquin mentioned about carbon markets, and I would love to hear your thoughts about carbon taxes, because we know that in the end, we all will need eventually carbon taxes can be a much stronger instrument. And I would love to hear from the financial sector point of view, if that would facilitate your life of decarbonizing some of those sectors. Thank you so much. Excellent
intervention. And now, I know, Mark, you have a long list of questions before you, but as moderators like myself, they are more or less like constitutional monarchs. They don't look like they have much power, but they have some power of last resort. So I'll introduce one question to you, which is about fintechs and financial innovation in the path to net zero. I have some time at the financial world, And I know that what we have before us is an enormous amount of innovation, not only in engineering, but also in finance. And when I see fintechs, this is a kind of huge biome, but we know what we're talking about. I mean, this very agile financial institutions. You think that this is an enormous opportunity for these institutions to go into the brave new world of climate finance? Now, it's a boy's job. I think we got right on time. I mean, if we can keep to 10, something like more than 10 minutes, and we still have more than 10 minutes for the questions from the audience. Thank you, Mark.
Well, fantastic interventions. I'm not going to be able to do justice to the questions, but I will try to address them and continue the dialogue. First on, and I'll go in order, largely in order. And Fernanda, starting with central bank mandates, and it's absolutely a critical question, of course, and she knows well, and it's useful to remind a broader audience that central bank mandates vary quite widely across the central banks, and in that environment, the Bank of England has, as of today, it didn't used to, it went through a period where it had quite a narrow mandate where all it really had to worry about was inflation. It's now expanded out to banking supervision, insurance supervision, and systemic risk, and oversight of the payment system as well. So it's a very broad mandate, and climate touches a number of those aspects. And so what the Bank of England can do and be involved in, and also given the legislative framework in the United Kingdom where climate, it's an explicit objective, legislative objective of the country, is broader. So recognizing that that's not true of all central banks, and I'm going to interpret a bit from my previous role, Bank of Canada, which had a more narrow remit, monetary policy, research, a bit on the payment side. And in that regard, we would see a role around new markets, including potentially a market for carbon offsets or compliance market, is in helping to ensure that again, I'm sorry to fall back on this word, but that the plumbing of the market is robust and resilient. So when you think about how the carbon offset market will likely develop, is in a two-tier market, that the expectation is that there will be a few exchange-traded contracts, base contracts, that are highly liquid, traded on exchanges, maybe Singapore, London, ICE, all three have put their hands up to trade these contracts or host these contracts. But the bulk of the market, the bulk of the global market, and this leans a bit into Joaquim's question, or the second part actually of Fernanda's question in terms of local versus global, the bulk of the market will be an OTC market with the reference to the exchange traded contract, because as I think one thing we know about carbon offsets is there's quite a wide variety of nature-based and other solutions, and it stretches all the way from avoided deforestation, some controversy about that, but avoided deforestation, which at least initially important, reforestation that's monoculture versus biodiversity, which therefore has other co-benefits, maybe co-benefits more explicitly for nature, for indigenous peoples, breakthrough technology offsets associated with direct air capture, hydrogen, sustainable aviation fuel, building the bridges into that can help enhance the economics. And all of those, the pricing of that is off the reference of the core exchange traded. So now you need a robust clearing and settlement system for both of those. I mean, it's easier on the exchange traded side, but you need one for the OTC side. There's a role for the central bank in and around there, regardless of its remit, in order to ensure that happens. The second thing I want to say around the offset markets is that, and first off, let me absolutely endorse and reinforce what Joaquim very elegantly put around part of the role for these offset markets is preserving and extending the existing very small carbon budget that we have. And there's potential for this market to add 10% to the carbon budget, maybe on some estimates 15% to the carbon budget for this decade, which is critical because, as Joaquim says, it buys time for scaling. Look, the renewable, there's a lot of renewable investment. It's highly economic, but you have to site the project, you have to build it, finance it, connect it. and it just has to roll out at very, very large scale in many jurisdictions, and that takes time. So buying time is worth a lot. And in other technologies, think hydrogen, direct air capture, others, we need time and investment to get the costs of those, the economics of those, the cost down, the economics up, so that then they can be rolled out in the 2030s and into the 2040s. And if we blow through our entire carbon budget before we get to either of those events, we have the catastrophic impacts and the negative feedback loops and everything. So it is really valuable to do that. Now, of course, it has to be done properly. Now, one of the things that is important to underscore, and I forget where I wrote it down, but I forget where it exactly comes in, is and maybe it's Anna was, it's fair to raise some of the criticisms around offsets. And I'd characterize one criticism around offsets is it's a get out of jail card for companies as opposed to buying time. It's that they won't focus on reducing their absolute emissions. And so we don't move ahead as a world. And there is a way to deal with that. And part of the core approach that's being taken is to have what's called demand side integrity. So the companies that buy the offsets have to meet certain criteria. And one of the core criteria in the strictest sense, and I'd be on this end of the spectrum, is the company has to have a net zero transition plan. It should be science-based. They should, it should be credible, should be making progress. And then the offsets are compensating for the emissions that they're making over that period of time. But this is part of what's being specified as the terms of the market, alongside what is more traditional and still necessary, so-called supply side integrity, making sure the tree is planted, it's still there, it's all those types of elements. There's true additionality. Now, Joaquin, the core of your question was. In essence, I think in essence, in terms of this market, is I would say that it's more likely to be a global market or a cross-border market, maybe as opposed to global, a cross-border market. Not everybody will qualify in the supply side integrity. A lot of the demand is going to come from companies that want to compensate for the emissions they have as they're getting their emissions down, or need to because it's required. And the way I like to think about it is I can't see a company like Microsoft signing off on their accounts if they don't really believe in the integrity of the offset they're purchasing. So there's the local development and the certification of the quality of the offset, the certification of the demand for the offset, the link through core hubs that are trading the reference contracts, the exchange traded contracts, and then an OTC market that comes across that builds up. And all of that architecture is being developed as we speak, and having and there is Brazilian representation on the governing body of the voluntary carbon market. There will be a supervisory. Winston, I know I've got a couple more things to say. The supervisory body of the that comes out of Article 6.4 of the COP agreement. So the linkages between the two should be established. But it's just, look, this has to work in Brazil, to be clear. I mean, we have to get it so that it works in Brazil from orders of magnitude. I mean, potentially 15% of the supply is in Brazil. And for a variety of reasons, we need to make sure that it has the integrity that's necessary. Let me say, the question is, and I'll finish on this, and I didn't do all the questions justice. Last 2 points I'll make. One is, Anna, where do I see the difficulties? And one of the issues where I see the difficulties, I'd say there's a couple of things. One is there's almost 500 institutions in here. The reality is twofold. One, when they first reveal what their carbon footprint is of the financed emissions, it won't be pretty. And for most of them, it won't be pretty. But the reality is it's not pretty for the world. We're headed to 3.25 degrees. Of course, many of the financial institutions will have portfolios that look somewhat like that. Bank of England does. world's largest pension fund does, some of the biggest insurers do, and those are insurers who manage them down. So the question is, where are they going from there? But it's easy to misunderstand where people are starting from versus where they intend to go. And the second thing is, I would say the energy transition is still pretty underspecified. We see where the renewable and the zero emission needs to go, but it is simplified where how fossil fuel activity and financing goes in the course of the next 5-10 years, with it tapering off, and what financing is required for that. It's become viewed that there's no financing for any fossil fuels, any fossil fuel infrastructure. That's not consistent with a 1.5 degree world, but it's not well recognized and it's not well articulated by the IEA, and that needs to be done very quickly. And part of that is being clear about what is stranded and then having responsible ownership of those stranded assets and unwinding them. Very last point I'll make, and then hand back to you, Winston, is on your question. Yes, is the short answer on the fintech side. I'll simplify it to a carbon blockchain or a clarity on carbon through the value chain. And the increased ability to, it's not quite there, but a number are trying to get it there, to tokenize carbon, so we have one true picture of carbon through a product and service, and then we can optimize and manage that down as efficiently, effectively as possible. So that's one application that's quite exciting, and I would even argue is necessary over time to get to where we need to go.
Entirely agree with you. Now, just one comment on this point about forests in Brazil. For you to know, the National Economic Development Bank has just announced a program in which it puts a lot of money, one by one, with the private sector for reforestation, high quality reforestation of destroyed forests like the Mata Atlântica, etc. This is a wonderful thing, but the BNDES is a necessary component of any blended finance initiative you have in Brazil. So it's a good start. We'll start as we are now, and I think it's going to be a great success. Now, we have now, we're still right on time. It's an amazing discipline we had. The questions now, they are filtered by our support team, and it's just huge, absolutely huge. So I have to be quite selective here. I'm very sorry for those that we do not not able to respond. And I'll ask you in droplets of 2 each. So we can control the time better. Now, the first one is very intelligent, made by an unidentified person, but clever. He said that we've been talking a lot about central banks, but what about the SEC? So what about what's the role of the regulation of securities markets in this context, which has been lagging a little bit in the United States. It's been announced, now coming, that's very good. It's also in Brazil, it's lagging. The central banks are going ahead, okay? Although the SECs are represented at the Financial Stability Board. Now, the second one is from a longtime friend and a board member of CEBRI, Clarissa Lins, and I'll read it. It's a very substantial, important question. Given the increasing pressure for divestment as opposed to finance the transition, how to guarantee that in industry companies that have credible decarbonization plans will have access to proper funds? How they will not be, because they are nasty polluters, they won't be penalized. I think that's the gist of the question, I guess.
There we go, droplets of 2. The first thing is that the securities regulators are catching up. IOSCO was quite instrumental, the group of securities regulators, quite instrumental in helping the development and launch of the IFRS ISSB. So that's positive. With respect to the SEC, as the questioner may know, but others may know as well, that it's currently consulting on a climate-related financial disclosure regime, what it should do, and in fact, partly in response to an FSOC recommendation and an executive order of the president, but out consulting on that. And there's a prospect of it's never the case that what the US does is the same as what the rest of the world does. Ideally, there's quite a substantial overlap in the Venn diagrams, but certainly there are a very large number of market participants in the US who are TCFD supporters, who are familiar with it, The consultation responses are public. There's a lot of support for that type of approach. So we'll see what the SEC decides on that. But I think they're now moving. And then the focus will then go to, well, are people making credible efforts to live up to their commitments? Again, something securities regulators will do. On Clarissa Lenz's a very good question. I mean, it's an essential question. It's an essential issue. We need to get capital to companies and projects that are going to decarbonize. Many of those are in high emitting industries, think cement, steel, aspects of energy. If you have a plan to decarbonize and you need capital, there should be that capital should flow, and the system is being set up to track transition, if I can put it that way. I was going to say track and reward transition. I think it will be rewarded in terms of actual decarbonization, as opposed to a simplified brown and green taxonomy that only rewards the end state. Of course, we'd all love to switch, flip a green switch and end up at the green end state, but that's not how things are going to work around the world. It's not how they can work, and that's why the emphasis is getting on the path to 1.5 degrees and rewarding accordingly. And we will. I think we're on the path to getting there, but we don't have it fully specified. So she's absolutely right to put the challenge in there.
Now we have 8 minutes, and there is a pretty highbrow one. So we finish with that. It's basically, how do you think is the future governance of the global climate governance system? I mean, do you see a parallel two-track world where the G20 becomes an important element together with UN, or do you think that UN can handle and go on as the main forum? Because when we know that you have this consensus problem at UN, and there's been a lot of interest in getting a club. I mean, Nobel Prizes have proposed a club instead of the consensus mechanism, a club of high emitters. The German government has approved actually something like that. It wants to sell that inside Europe, and if it gets traction, you may get some kind of club which may be more effective. And what's your view on that?
Well, I think the UN process, you would expect me to say this, but is from experience, the UN process is essential. There are far too many countries and people, fundamentally, that would be left behind in a all-powerful club that makes these decisions. Those who've done the least to cause the issue are the most affected by it, and will be the most. And so the UN process is essential. I think the question, as you rightly say, is highbrow. It's a sophisticated question. I'm interested in colleagues' response to it. That said, some of the big architecture that will really move the needle on climate will need to be agreed, brokered, accelerated through. I think the G20 is the right framework for it. So large-scale markets, a new approach, and I touched on this briefly, we didn't have a chance to go into it, but a new approach to country platforms, which much more effectively uses the balance sheets of the World Bank and others to get multiples of private capital as opposed to fractions of private capital crowded in to the emerging and developing world at scale, that helps flip into a virtuous cycle of higher ambition NDCs from countries because they know it's going to be financed, and a private sector which is over here looking for net zero aligned or Paris aligned assets that will then see them in the emerging world that has higher not overnight Paris aligned, but on that trajectory and then qualify. So I think the question is right in that you need both. At least that's the way I'm going to interpret the question. The Carbon Club thing, I'm nervous about. I'll be candid. We're in a process of raising ambition. We're getting some traction. The charge for Sharm el Sheikh is okay. Come back and do better. be more specific. We're going to get the financial sector to be more specific, get these markets up and running. Countries come back and do more, would potentially have these flows of capital. And this is a way where we're coming together to have, as opposed to say, well, you're not doing enough, here's a stick. I'm simplifying the concept, but I would like to think that it's certainly not it's not the most constructive way to move it forward. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, yes, defenders present it as a kind of something to diffuse the threats of countervailing duties, and also that it may not apply to non-members. So we can still have something which is a dual track, but that's speculative.
It depends on how it's developed. I mean, I'm not dismissing it. I'm saying I said it makes me nervous because the way it can be developed is can be more exclusionary than what you just described.
Entirely agree. Well, that's an amazing punctuality, especially in Brazil. So I don't know whether anyone has to make a quick question among the participants.
Or comment. A comment. I'd welcome a comment from just observations about these issues.
We have some time before people start switching off. So, is there any comment from you?
I just want
we all want.
Maybe I'll start. I think the last point that Mark just made about including countries and different population in the discussion is key, right? So a lot of the decision making moves forward more quickly when the bigger, larger economies are involved, but having the other economies participating as well on the process and on the discussion is very important. And the challenges are different across different populations in different countries. So the combination of UN or separate club or G20 I think is the way to go here. Thanks a lot for the event. This was great.
Well,
maybe I say something, then leave Joaquin to give the last words.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, first it was really good debate, so thank you so much. And Mark, I like your comment that when you're concerned about when all the financial institutions look at their carbon footprint, the picture will not be as pretty as obviously people expect, but I think people expect also the picture not to be pretty. I hope we will be able to say, I don't know, in 10 years' time, that the picture is much nicer. I really hope so, because obviously I think since Paris, the last 5 years, we knew. So the picture got worse in this last period. So I hope this initiative that you are leading will really help us to accelerate making the picture nicer, because we have had the science telling us very loudly about what we should not do, but hopefully the picture will look much prettier soon. Thank you so much.
Joaquin, do you want to say something? You're mute, Joaquin.
Unmute. First, I mean, how amazing it's really to have this discussion, and how much we have to do have in front of us. And I think that the financial sector is really getting more and more serious about that. I have to recognize that here in Brazil, also the leadership of the central bank, but the commitment of the banks, including in addressing complicated things like in the Amazon, and really contributing on finding solutions to that. And I would just highlight your remark among so many important things you mentioned, which is how we can find ways to channel resources for the developing world. And I'm talking here more about low-income countries to have this transition. It's part of the whole dream of global development, and especially, I mean, it's still under the shade, the shadow, I would say, of COVID having this priority. It's really important, and it has to be part of this resetting that will really shape our world for the next 10, 15 years. So thank you for mentioning that too.
Thank you, Joaquin. Now, Mark, before I send the floor to you again to say your final words, I would like to thank you very much. I'll put my CEBRI hat and thank you dearly for being with us today. I'd also like to thank my friend and your friend, Luis Ildefonso Simões Lopes, for helping me make this event possible. And the floor is yours for your final words.
Look, I think I've enjoyed this immensely. It's challenging, as it should be. But I think what I hope people will take away, and certainly I take away, is just the thoughtfulness and the rigor and the spirit of intention of trying to address this issue. And this is how you solve an issue like this. You get, a broad sense of the direction, and you get a lot of very dedicated people working in the same direction, and they come up with ideas and with a degree of pragmatism, which is the last element, which is we can't wait for the perfect. We have to be implementing now what we can, and then move forward. And I feel like that's where we're headed. And for me, that was the spirit of the discussion here.
Thank you very much. I look forward for in the near future to have you in person in Brazil.
So do I. I can't wait to get out of this room. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Take care,
Bye-bye.
Joaquin. Bye-bye.
Mark.